First, all of the adjudicator, after debating, you have to go to SG 419. And second, all of the debater and staff have to go to the Thai pavilion in the first floor, or you can ask more information from any staff outside the room. It gives me great pleasure to invite the first speaker for the opposition team to open the debate.
By 2020, the damage that the real and present threat of climate change will do to our planet will be irreversible. Yet, right now, carbon capture and storage technology invented by Ohio State University, which has the potential to drastically reduce the emissions of the USA, cannot be released for wide-scale commercial use because of a patent that grants a monopoly to the inventor over that technology. Prohibitively expensive licensing fees that patent holders charge prevent innovation, and as a consequence, we are approaching 2020 without technology that can stop climate change. So, what do we support on Team Proposition? We would abolish all patents on green technology, and we define green technology as any invention that would reduce the damage to the environment. So, we're talking about biofuels, solar panels, wind farms, etc. To compensate people for their effort and their innovation, we would give them government funding that would be dependent on how much benefit that innovation would offer to the environment. In addition, we would offer tax breaks, subsidies, no thank you, and direct government research. This means that we will be paying people for their innovation, and as a result, we think that we will actually get more innovation in the green technology field. I have two points in substantive. Firstly, that the state should not recognise, no thank you, this form of intellectual property, and secondly, that this abolishing patents on green technology would lead to more ubiquitous and higher quality technology. Our second speaker will discuss the effects on the developing world and the environmental lobby. So on the first of these, about why the state should not respect this form of intellectual property. We think that all patents are morally questionable, and this is true, no thank you, for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think that research is often undertaken by public institutions, which means that they use public money, but they are also building on previous thoughts which are also in the public sphere. More importantly than that, we think that when you're looking at universities, their point of being is to engage in research. All of this means that they shouldn't have an exclusive right over this form of innovation. But secondly, even when it isn't directly funded or directly innovated by public institutions, private companies still get massive amounts of government support. So for example, GM was given enormous amounts of government funding to develop electric cars. Even when they don't get direct government funding, they generally build on ideas that pre-exist in society that were developed due to government funding.
Information.
So thank you. But even more than that, ladies and gentlemen, we think that this form of intellectual property is very different to other forms of property rights. Because unlike holding a house or buying a house, not only one person can hold intellectual property and can develop an idea at the same time. People can come up with an idea for innovative new technology independently of each other, and they shouldn't be arbitrarily rewarded ownership over that idea just because they were born first or educated first and hence have that control. This indicates to us, ladies and gentlemen, that these intellectual property rights are not absolute, and instead they're limited. No, thank you. And the clearest example of that is that intellectual property expires, or these forms of patents expires after 25 years. This indicates to us that you should only do this when it benefits society. And we think that this form of limitation, no thank you, is especially true when we are talking about green technology. Why? Because first of all, green technology produces a universal good that cannot be internalized solely by that company or by the people who own it. But secondly, we believe that it would be immoral for companies to try and make money off people who are suffering, no thank you, in desperate circumstances and in desperate situations. Thirdly, we think that it would also be immoral for these companies to try and hold on to something, to hold on to this technology, which, if it was effectively utilized and effectively developed, could save our world from massive amounts of harm and from the devastation that would accrue due to global warming and climate change. So therefore we believe, ladies and gentlemen, that even if it was true that intellectual property matters, it would be far less important for us, in ensuring that we save our world from the consequences of climate change. So on to this second question, and I'll take you in a moment, as to why this leads to more ubiquitous and higher quality technology. Yes, please.
Does your side believe that greater social utility always justifies stealing someone else's ideas?
Well, first of all, we don't think that you are stealing someone else's ideas. As I've explained before, we think that a lot of people can independently come up with these concepts. But secondly, we think that this is more than just social utility. We think that it's about an element of urgency, it's about the element of necessity that exists in this place. We think that we would be potentially willing to question patents that apply to other situations, but that depends on the case. So, what limitations, no thank you, do patents place on environmental limitation? There are a few. Firstly, in terms of patent litigation. Patent law has become expanded, especially by the United States Supreme Court, and this has led to the enabling of broad patents. As a result, companies are unwilling to innovate because they are too scared of violating existing patent law and hence accruing enormous amounts of costs in terms of litigation. It is very difficult for companies to know when they are violating patent law because the law is very difficult to understand. Even if companies get to the point of which they innovate, no thank you, their money is often sucked up by large companies who engage in litigation and the costs that suing in court cases, etc., accrue to them, which means that even if they do end up maintaining hold over this patent, they lack the capital to effectively develop that patent. Secondly, we think that there are massive harms in terms of patent trolls. Large companies purchase thousands of patents and sit on them, refusing to license them out to other companies, instead trying to enrich themselves by denying the market access to these patents. We've seen this in Saudi Arabia, for example, where they bought up patents on green technology to ensure that no alternative to oil comes to the market. Yes, please.
By taking away the right to make profit from companies, what incentive do you provide for expensive research and development?
I'm getting onto that later at this point. I think that our model effectively deals with that. So, C, in terms of licensing fees, we think that the perverse incentives exist for companies to hold out in terms of licensing so that they will release that later in the future when the need for green technology becomes stronger and hence they are able to make the most amount of profit that they possibly can, which means that other companies cannot improve on existing forms of technology. No, thank you. Even when companies do choose to release those licensing fees, it is done so with prohibitively high costs, which means that especially small companies cannot afford to innovate. But D, we think that the patent office is incredibly slow, which means that it's difficult to gain patents and it's difficult to receive compensation as a result. How does our model better incentivize innovation? Firstly, our model guarantees benefit in terms of compensation, which means that these companies still have an incentive to research. And this is especially true of universities who suffer under the status quo out of an inability to correctly value how much any form of research they partake in will have. Secondly, in terms of a first mover advantage, the company who first develops this new wind farm or this new form of green technology is able to release that to the market first. That means they can establish a consumer base and as a result make more profit, more money and achieve compensation in that way. Thirdly, we think the brand image factor means that people will still go to a company that is well known or has a good consumer background. We think that also we create better innovation in that we have collaboration, which means that companies now have an incentive to work together so that they can both gain reward that otherwise wouldn't happen. We've already seen this happen in TRIPS in the EU, where they removed all patents on medical technology, which resulted in medical innovation increasing. This means that even if we get less technology, we get cheaper, more accessible, more beneficial technology we are proud to propose.
I thank for the first opposition speaker for her speech, and now to open the case for the opposition, we will talk more for the opposition view.
We have seen progress in green technology, but they still aren't viable in any meaningful sense economically or cost-wise. And that's why lifting patent law is going to retrograde all the progress that we have made. And that's why side opposition stands by the principle that turning private research into public property only hurts green technology. We have three arguments. One, that it's wrong to steal an idea. Two, that they hurt green technology development. And three, my second speaker will tell you why they turn companies away from the green movement. Our model is simple. One, we would not abolish existing patent laws for green technology. Two, instead, we support subsidizing access to green technology when and where possible. This could mean covering the licensing fee for small SMEs. It could mean investing in green energy infrastructure, green tech transfer to developing countries or tax breaks for households. Three, we'll simplify patent law if that's the issue and make patent law officers more effective. And four, obviously patents will still expire after a set period of time, as they pointed out already, similar to how drug patents expire. So, before I go into my piece, 2 points of rebuttal. One, on intellectual property, no. Two, on innovation. First, on intellectual property. Now the first argument they had was, well, these are based on pre-existing ideas that other people may also be thinking about, so really you don't own this idea, you have nothing to do with it. Really? Just because there's a vague idea out there, that silicon when used to get electrons and knocked off by light, will create some sort of energy, does not mean that anyone out there actually knows how to do this in practice. So we see that sort of innovation is a specific idea, and that's why you can't patent a vague idea, but you have to patent a very specific mechanism by which you actually make this idea meaningful in generating electricity. We don't think that a vague idea is a sufficient response. No. Second, they said, well, universities and publicly funded things are only for research anyway. One, very often publicly funded research doesn't have patents on it because it's publicly funded. Two, the fact that something is solely for the purpose of research does not make this research not theirs, right? In fact, it implies to us that universities won't survive if they don't get the money from patents, and then you lose the research in that case. So we don't think it's true that you don't own these ideas. No. But I said, okay, even if you have these ideas, there's a societal benefit that accrues. One, we argue that their picture of how the world is going to collapse in 2020, unless we remove all patents of green technologies, simply isn't true. No. That's not the state we are in now. We don't think it lies to us for the pressures we face. We say, at current rates, even by 2050, and the rate green technology is progressing, we ought to be fine. Second, we say individuals have rights. I'm going to tell you more about that later on, my second argument. That's why you can't just go and steal Bill Gates' car, even if you think that's a really good idea, and frankly, it's already rich enough, it doesn't need it. No. So, second argument, that's that first argument intellectual property dealt with. Second one, on innovation. First thing they told us, well, patent law is very complex, so people are afraid of infringing it, and also patent law is just really slow. Okay, this is an argument for reforming patent law systems, not for abolishing all patents. No, we think it's a generic argument against patents in general. Second, they said, but patent trolls. Okay, we think, once again, this is a generic argument that applies to many other sorts of patents, but not to green technology. Why? Because in green technology, the increments that you make are not the sort of things in smartphones and stuff, where there are lots and lots of ones, and you buy thousands and thousands of them. Very often, these are controlled by massive corporations, which are funding most of the development. The patent trolls don't exist. And that's only the example of Saudi Arabia. You know what Saudi Arabia is doing with all those patents? Not just sitting on them. Saudi Arabia has become the largest developer of renewable energy, apart from China and Germany, because it recognizes that oil is going to run out, and it wants to be in the new green market when that happens. So we don't think that's true. Finally, said licensing fees. So they fundamentally misunderstand how SMEs develop in the field of green research, and we'll talk more about that later in my argument as well. And finally, the only response no thank you to incentives was the government will fund everything. One, we say governments have a very bad track record of picking good technologies to back. No, we don't think they fund the right things. We think companies are much better because they have the expertise. Two, we say that if you want a government to fund everything, that's a massive cost on your government. We don't think that's a viable policy that works in real life. So we don't think the world is in danger, as they say. We don't think they improve innovation. First argument, why you can't steal an idea? Say you own your ideas, hold on a moment, and they should not be stolen. Because you worked hard to develop them, even if the vague concept may have floated around somewhere. Because it took time and effort to make that idea a reality. And we think you should be rewarded for that. Yes?
We don't steal Bill Gates' car, but we steal millions of dollars a year from him for tax. Why is it okay to take people's money in the name of social utility, but not their ideas?
I think companies and corporations that create these green technologies already pay the tax within existing social framework. Why is it okay to take more from them than from anyone else? Back to my point. We say there's a spectrum, right? So for SMEs, like you, which create, like, we find innovative design features to maximize the base technologies that we already have. This sort of new technology and new patent, involves like someone working in his garage for months or years on end. You see, that sort of effort deserves to be rewarded, and they take away that reward, especially because, the government is unlikely to go and fund every single guy working in his garage on a way to like revolutionize, on a way to coat wind turbines to solar panels to make them more efficient. No. But okay, even for huge companies like BP and Shell, don't let them lie to you when they say corporations are just these entities which have no rights. Because corporations represent their employees, they represent their shareholders, people who have invested their life savings, into these corporations on the expectation of some sort of return. When you suddenly tell this corporation, the billions of dollars you just spent developing solar panels, no longer go back to you, we say that massively hurts people who have spent their life savings, who have lost their property in that case. We don't think it's fair for their side. And that's why intellectual property is still property. We say, on our side, you get a patent to benefit you for that profit. We say that's why it expires after 20 to 25 years, because after that time you no longer profit. But within that period, you deserve to be able to profit on that idea. Second, possibly more important argument on the better development of green technology. We say green technology, isn't yet viable, and that's why it needs more research and development, right? Solar panels are currently not energy efficient with regard to their cost and their lifespan, they're already the best sorts of green technology we have compared to geothermal or hydroelectric. So there are two main fields of development in green technology, and they don't seem to be cognizant of this nuance. First, the first field is finding creative ways of using existing base technologies and redesigning the structures of them so that you combine them together, right? For example, coating solar panels on top of wind turbines to make them more efficient. That's normally done by SMEs. The second major one is improving the base technology by making solar panels, for example, more efficient at absorbing light and translating that into electricity. So these are often done by massive corporations. I'll go through these one by one. So for improving the base technology, normally done by massive corporations. So this is incredibly expensive research, because the base technology or base idea is already there, and so increments to that often cost a lot of money. So for example, to improve solar panels work on the concept that if you take a pane of silicon and light hits it, it knocks out an electron, and therefore the electron, when it travels through a particular pathway, generates electricity. The problem is getting all the electrons to go in the same direction. And in order for that to work at the tiny scales which are needed for cost efficiency, you require things like you need a couple of quantum tunneling effects, you need a couple of quantum microscopes. These require huge R&D labs, which require economies of scale, and therefore require huge amounts of research and investment. We say in this particular instance, removing that patent removes the incentive for companies to invest in those research. It removes that because you can't get any profit back, right? Because the moment you spend billions of dollars on creating something, once someone else finds that idea, they can manufacture it as well, and you don't make back your R&D costs. That's why, for example, after the Indian Supreme Court chose to remove patents on medicines in India, companies like GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca just pulled out and denied Indians of medicines. We say that is exactly the sort of thing you do when you make it impossible for companies to enact in this way. Second, for SMEs, we've already told you that these are companies that work by selling their patents to bigger companies by using base technologies from the 1980s and redesigning them. We say, in this case, you deny the ability of them to sell patents and for them to survive for these reasons. You hurt green technology and you hurt people's right to property.
I thank for the first opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the proposition, I will call upon the proposition team.
ladies and gentlemen, the opposition wanted to suggest to us that the state should not take your property for social utility. Let's remember what exactly social utility looks like in this debate. It means the 20 million climate change refugees who will exist by 2020 being more likely to have protection from the perilous fate that is facing them. It means stopping private corporations from gouging the people of those nations for the problems that they created in the first place and the solutions that they're trying to profit off. We accept that to some extent there will be sacrifice of intellectual property. We think they need to start engaging with the huge social benefits that we're getting because of that. Two questions to remark. Firstly, do you have a right to this specific form of private monopoly? And secondly, does locking important technologies in GM safe help or hinder environmental innovation? So let's look at the first issue of whether you have a right to this monopoly. There are two things we have to look at here. The first is how we should value intellectual property in this debate. Because we would question firstly whether the overwhelming type of patents that are prominent in this debate are the types of patents that the opposition wants to defend. Their only response to what we told you about very broad and non-specific and quite silly patents was to use the form of patent office. Firstly, a number of problems with the patent office are inherent because these corporations have the capacity to use their huge legal power to defend what are often quite silly patents, especially when, since you can take out as many patents as you want on as many innovations as you want, you have no cost to making some of them quite false. But secondly, they can't just promise reform in this debate when the overwhelming reality is that it's been slow. But let's take the harder case for this proposition team, which is innovations that are legitimate. We still think that there are several reasons why you do not have an absolute right to those. First was because they were often from public institutions. We don't think the universities survived off this form of funding. It was just another form of revenue because the state's giving them subsidies, we're happy to give them more. But we thought that given that they were often significant in creating these innovations, like for instance Ohio State University has been one of the biggest innovators in the area of carbon capture and storage, we think that it's important that since they get that funding from the state, they should ensure that they give back to that state and not try to gouge its consumers. But secondly, even if they weren't public institutions, they were public thoughts because every innovator survives on building off the shoulders of others. And we don't think opposition did enough to respond to this. We think that if this is stealing, let's remember that the opposition is stealing from people too, because you only get 25 years of profit from your innovations, and after that they're stealing everything else you could ever get. We think they need to justify that important principled inconsistency. But secondly, we think that to the extent that you do have a right to this property, we are compensating you for that right because we ensure that subsidies are given to those people. Let's look secondly then about how we are to evaluate this right against other rights. We think that the opposition wanted to ask whether the state should be able to steal for the sake of creating social utility. As we pointed out in a point of information, the state steals from people all the time. It's called taxation. The response to that in our point of information was to say, well, we already have tax, so there's a reasonable expectation that will exist. Well, under our system, there will be a reasonable expectation that the revenue you get from your patents won't be from gouging consumers, it'll be from the state subsidies that you receive as a consequence. So let's just remember in this debate that the first incentive that Singapore is creating is to hang on to your patent for as long as possible, because the value of the environmental innovation that it represents is going to keep on appreciating as that threat becomes more and more significant. That is terrible, because it means that these corporations' incentives is to hang on to that patent until it's too late to create the change, because we need to act now. That was the sort of policy of appeasement they couldn't get away from. Secondly, does locking important technologies in GM safe help or hinder the environment? Let's look firstly at the quantity of innovation. They wanted to suggest it would be significantly reduced. We pointed out firstly that there were still significant private incentives to innovate, like a first mover advantage and branding advantages. Obviously those are slightly less, but it indicates that there will still be lots of innovation on the outside. But secondly, we thought the state could make up the shortfall. How did they respond to that? They did two things. The first is to suggest that the state wouldn't pick winners. We thought that was in tension with the rest of Singapore's case, which also wanted to support subsidies to a significant extent, which we think represents an acknowledgement that the state is better at picking winners. The reason why that is true is because the state looks at the effects of that innovation on everyone in society, and it takes into account the huge positive externality of doing something that's going to fix climate change. But secondly, they said this would be a big drain on states' budgets. We think that states will be able to deal with that because they acknowledge that climate change is a huge issue and they have to be able to deal with it. The types of technologies the first opposition wanted to talk about is significantly more likely to happen on the our side. Let's look secondly at the quality of innovation. Because even if we had slightly fewer research projects coming out, we still thought that it was better because they were in the public sphere and more likely to be available to every consumer rather than just a small minority of them. We presented significant benefits. The first of those was to collaboration. And insofar as the first opposition speaker wanted to say it was better as long as you had big economies of scale, they were more likely to happen under the proposition team. Because now your incentive wasn't to work against your competitor, as it is when you need a patent because it's a race to get there first. Now there was an incentive to work with that competitor because you could share that subsidy. But secondly, we thought there were significant benefits to opening up this market, not just to the biggest firms who are able to protect patents, but to smaller ones too, who are more likely to be able to appeal to those state subsidies. So that's why there's only one team in this debate that's going to protect the environment, and that's the proposition. Turning then to substantive, I'll make 2 points, and I'll take you in a minute. The first is that obstructive patents do significant harm to the developing world. Yes?
On our side, the state will only subsidize licensing fees when companies prove that there's significant economic and social benefit. How is this a tension?
Well, that wasn't the part that I was saying was intention. Like, we'll obviously also only subsidize things if we think there's a benefit to them. The problem was that you said the state can't pick the winner. The process of deciding whether there's a benefit is what we call picking winners. Back to this substantive. The problem at the moment, and this strikes at the heart of the opposition's case, is that the incentive is to sell patent licenses to the people who have the greatest capacity to pay, rather than the people who need those licenses and that innovation the most. What does that mean? Firstly, it means developing countries struggle to buy patents. That's because often those patents are hugely expensive, because firms in the developing world and the developed world bid up prices, which means that it's in the incentive of the patent holder to sell it only to the people who can pay large amounts. But there are also significant problems with the bargaining position of developing countries, because they're the least likely to be able to have the extensive litigation teams needed to try to take out something, action against a non-specific patent. Lastly, the developing world has consistently been very unwilling to provide development aid to assist with those problems. And the result of that is that innovation doesn't spread to the developing world. It's locked away in the developed world, which doesn't deal with the fact that the overwhelming scale of these problems is happening in the countries which have the least capacity to buy these innovations. The way in which we solve that is because now the US's government's incentives is to pay firms in the US in reward for their innovation and then to tear up that patent, which means that their incentives are aligned with the incentives of the rest of that world. It means that we're likely to enable them to help everyone at the same time as they help their own environment. Let's look secondly at how patents threaten the strength of the environmental lobby. We think firstly that having patents on these products suggests that the environment is just like other corporate issues. It says that it's right for corporate institutions to withhold these innovations in order to protect their profits. It says that it's similar to any other problem you could have in the corporate sphere. We think we need a very clear signal that this is a different type of problem, unlike an innovation on a smartphone, and only the proposition provides that. But secondly, this represents a state endorsement of what's real, because we think that this policy says that climate change is so definitely happening and so certain that the state needs to take away existing paradigms of intellectual property and replace them with new ones. That is a significant signal because it reaffirms the state's commitment to fighting climate change at all costs. Ladies and gentlemen, the correct way to fight climate change is to get the important technologies that the opposition supported out in the public instead of locking them away in safes. We don't think corporations have a right to that property when it was not rightfully theirs in the first place and when it was used to exploit the world, and the developing world in particular, we propose.
Thank for the second proposition speaker for his speech. And now to continue the case for the opposition, I will call upon the opposition team.
Let's start by asking 2 questions today. First, on their principle of extreme social utility. Secondly, on which side truly incentivizes innovation. First, on their principle, the main thrust coming from propositions is one of massive social utility, because the utility is so great that people will drown by 2020 otherwise, therefore their policy is justified. To this end, they use the paradox taxation. I'm going to break it right now. First, within this principle of massive social utility is untenable, because to be taken to its fullest logical conclusion, it would justify extremities. For instance, you will force companies to price all their great technology jeopardizes the rights of companies, and moreover, we told you in our first speaker about how employees themselves have rights, and when you take away their property rights, these are the very employees working in corporations who are hurt. This analysis was corresponding to it. But second, on this idea that the need is so pressing, by 2020 we will all perish. This is simply untrue, guys, factually. Like, we are not going to perish by 2020. Truth be told, the period for reversing climate change is over. So now our realistic progress is on ensuring that we can adapt to climate change. That is something that does not happen by 2020, but stretches over decades. So truthfully, proposition is not in my priorities. Wrong. But next, on the other principal idea that you steal ideas from the public. One, this is infinitely elastic. When I compose a piece of music, I use my life experiences, the ideas I get from the public sphere as well. You don't tell an artist that he or she can't have copyright laws or any ownership over their ideas. No. Two, it's not even true. You don't steal an idea wholesale. Yes, you might have a vague idea of how solar energy works, but the public doesn't tell you that you need to put this photovoltaics up in this specific instance, coated with, for instance, like some thermal insulator to be placed over a body of water, which can then channel their energy onto silicon. Such massive amounts of details can't be stolen from the public sphere. Don't lie to us. No. Finally, the last principle idea is about how public institutions and private companies get government funding. In our first speaker, we told you that the bulk of research does not come from public institutions. But more than that, even if we have said that public funds this research, this doesn't justify returning the returns through this patent. For instance, we argue that people already pay their returns when they, for instance, are able to use their money and sell their green technology to public good. When corporations pay taxation, for instance, they are returning that public funding. They haven't told us why specifically through patents. But finally, if this research is funded through government funding but still relies on patent laws, this suggests to us that the risk of venturing to green technology as well as the costs are massive. And if that's the case, they can't tell us that a simple government subsidy or compensation is going to fit the bill. This is where I transition to my next point of contention on innovation. The only alternative was compensation from the state. First of all, given that most countries in Europe are in debt right now, the US itself is in debt, how exactly is the government going to fund it? Given that governments are only fulfilling 1/3 of their aid budget for climate change, how are they going to subsidize and compensate so many large corporations for green technology? They haven't explained to us. But two, even if we are said being more charitable, that governments can compensate to some extent, this compensation will be much less than what a patent would have otherwise paid them. So realistically, government compensation can't cover the full cost of R&D. No. But next, the main line coming from proposition is that companies are scared of violating patent laws. We have two responses. First, for your big companies, you haven't addressed what you do to change your incentive structures. What you now do is to change your incentive structure from innovating to manufacturing. Because now innovating doesn't grant them an advantage over their smaller competitors. This means that the bulk of innovation, which comes from the largest corporations, now doesn't carry out anymore. Secondly, we told you about small and medium enterprises. They don't get the bulk of their profits by the usual way by large corporations. They often sell their patents to large companies for development. For instance, Xenoscom, a Silicon Valley green startup, sold their patent for carbon-9 photovoltaic cells to General Electric for $1.5 billion. Afterwards, this money was used to pioneer a photovoltaic wind turbine for the deserts of Arizona. So they fundamentally ignore our spectrum about small and medium enterprises and how small and medium enterprises compete on a different metric. Finally, on this idea of a state signal that climate change is real, we think this is silly, right? Governments already take measures to ensure that, for instance, carbon trading, cap and trade, for instance, all ensures and signals very clearly to the public that climate change is real. We don't think it's going to be a marginal and significant difference. On to my substantive, which will further clash the material brought up in the second speaker, about how you turn companies away from the green movement. First, about how you erode the incentive of companies to support pro-environment legislation. This tackles the point about the developing world. Currently, we align the economic incentives of companies with legislation. Because I, as a company, if I have an advantage in green technology, I am more likely to support cap and trade or carbon taxes. Because my competitors will suffer more from a carbon tax if I have a green technology advantage. Yes?
Does a ship's captain who finds a child drowning in the sea have a right to charge that person as much as they can just because they own their ship?
First, we think this is completely analogous, right? You underestimate the threat. Here, it's not as though companies, by continuing to cling onto their patents, are going to condemn people into directly drowning. So it's fundamentally this analogous. Don't try to scaremonger us today. So back to my argument. In 2010, we saw the leading green technology companies in Europe band together to support the EU's bid to enhance the EU cap and trade system through extensive lobbying efforts. Crucially, Essentially, this only happens when companies' incentives and interests are protected by patent laws, because now they have their competitive edge. No, on the proposition side, when they lose this competitive edge, when patent laws are abolished, this is when they start forming the precise lobby groups they talked about in the second speaker to block legislation for cap and trade, to block legislation for carbon tax, and this hurts the environment in the long run. But the second tier of my argument is that you now need companies to adopt predatory pricing. In the status quo, companies have no incentive for predatory pricing, which means artificially lowering prices. No, to price out their competitors. Because in the status quo, when you lower prices, this also hurts your profit margin as well. But currently, now you change the incentive structures of large companies. They think either I lower my prices so low that I crowd out all my competitors, or I have suffered because now I no longer have patent laws protecting me. No. What this then happens is that companies artificially drive prices down such that their profit margins of other companies and their competitors are diminished. This means they compete, no, in the same field of green technology. So you lower diversity of green technology replacement. No. Why is this harmful? Because once companies eliminate competition through predatory pricing, they can now artificially raise costs after that, given that they have established oligopolies. So now, you make green technology even more unaffordable. Even on propositions metric, now green technology becomes prohibitively expensive and it's harder for new companies to enter the market. For instance, in 1997, the Argentinian government suspended patent rights for GM food technology to increase domestic agricultural use. GM giant Yipco sold GM seeds at 11% of the market rate, forcing smaller competitors to close down. In the absence of competition, Yipco then inflated prices of seeds to 30 times the previous rate. So even the metric about how you have less research but cheaper technology is false, because they make green technology even more expensive in the long run, given that they facilitate the building up of extensive monopolies and oligopolies. So as a result, they make it harder for companies to subsidize the transfer of green technologies even to the developing world. So on both metrics about quality research as well as the price of green technology, proposition has conclusively failed. That's why we argue the principle that turning private research into public property only hurts the environment.
For the second opposition speaker for the speech, and now we continue the case for the proposition, and we call upon the opposition team.
Ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't matter in this debate if we don't die by the year 2020. What does matter is that regardless or not of the timeline, climate change is a serious threat that threatens to destroy society. We think that is more than just the social utility Singapore wanted to talk about. Moreover, we think this is analogous to a child drowning in the ocean, particularly because the people who will be prevented from accessing this vital technology, being poorer people in poorer countries in the developing world, are particularly hurt when companies have an incentive to gouge them and stop that technology from being dispersed. I'll talk about three issues in this speech. Firstly, is intellectual property justified in this case? Secondly, which team does a better job of actually saving the world? And thirdly, some of the ancillary impacts, such as political capital. So, is intellectual property justified in this case? We told you that all patent laws were questionable, but especially this one required the government to not recognise them for the sake of saving the environment. The reason was the urgency of the problem. That was one of the reasons. Singapore's point of information argument was that the social utility justifies stealing someone's ideas. First of all, we tell you that the word social utility really undersell our imperative quite a lot in this debate. We think global warming threatens to kill millions and destroy society, and you can't enjoy much social utility past that point. And secondly, yes, we do steal things if it helps social utility, like we steal people's actual property, for example, through tax. No, we don't steal Bill Gates' car, but we take millions of dollars of him every year for the purposes of aiding social utility. Why can we take someone's money, but not their ideas, especially given the difference between things like money and things like ideas? Like, you can't own an idea to the extent that you own physical property. Secondly, say to a large extent, people only get this innovation or this idea to the extent that the state put in a lot of work and a lot of funding into starting that innovation process in the first place. And secondly, just because you arbitrarily were the first one to come up with it or had the capital to get that going, doesn't mean you should have exclusive rights to it forevermore. The final response we got was, yeah, but like corporations already pay tax. This is like an unjustified overreach. Okay, if we are supporting an effective tax rise to stop the problem of global warming, we are proud to propose in this debate. Finally, let's deal with Singapore's ridiculously sympathetic characterization of the people who come up with the patents in this debate. Like it's a guy in his garage with a spanner working all night to come up with some new invention that will save the world.
Information.
Yeah, right. We think it is more people who just arbitrarily have the capital, to have the research and development necessary to come up with some idea in the first place. That is like the giant oligopolistic corporations that can use their market power to the extent that that innovation does get developed to exploit people and to make and to have the perverse incentives to make sure that information isn't proliferated to the extent that it needs to be. We think that was undermined by their own analysis when they told us that huge corporations are particularly necessary in this equation. At the end of this thing, we've shown you that intellectual property doesn't matter that much, and it can especially be taken from companies when it's a question of saving the world from global warming. So, which team does a better job of saving the world from this environmental catastrophe? We told you in our model we would have things like subsidies, tax incentives, payments to companies, as well as direct research. I'll take them in a moment. Even if all private research and innovation stop, we will still have the public research which has proven itself really effective. But we don't think all that innovation will stop. Yes.
You tell us the patent law office is really inefficient. How much worse do you think the government becomes when it has to study every single potential new green technology and determine, is this going to be beneficial? How much money should I fund in? How inefficient do you think the government will be in that case?
Yeah. So Singapore said that the state cannot decide which to fund, which innovation to fund, or which invention to fund. That's funny, considering Singapore themselves supported subsidies as well for certain innovations which they regarded as really useful. They said, I'll basically quote word for word, that will fund innovation or inventions that promise huge economic and environmental benefits. Where is your angel, your genius, your omniscient actor that can decide for you guys that we don't have an outside of the house? If your government can make those calculations in an effective way, we can do that too. And like you guys support government, the picking winners through the patent system, which we think is far more opaque and far more complicated than just judging on a merit basis whether this innovation will be useful to preventing carbon emissions. We told you that the patent law was incredibly convoluted and opaque and inefficient. We think we got an incredibly flippant response from Singapore, which said, we'll just reform the patent system. That is way easier said than done, guys. And if Singapore had some awesome way to just fix patents to the extent that we get perfect innovation, it's a shame that they're keeping that under their hat so long, ladies and gentlemen. Because we think there are structural inherent reasons as to why it is not that easy to fix the patent office, because it's actually really hard just to judge whether, to what extent people's property rights extend over a certain area, and there's also the government incentives that you talked about. But we don't think it's just a question of saying we'll reform patents, because we don't need to do that outside the house. It is always easier from our perspective. Let's look at Singapore's second argument, which they tried to bamboozle us with science language, which we think is not that relevant in this debate, because there's no specific reason why any aspect of science that they taught us about could not be performed equally well or better by the state. The only real reason they wanted to give us was economies of scale. We obviously get more of that on the outside of the house because the state is bigger and has more money than any corporation they wanted to entrust with coming up with this innovation themselves. Singapore told us that you take away the incentives of those companies to innovate. You say, if that's true, it doesn't matter because we can replace that with direct government funding research because we don't need it to that extent. But we still give them incentives. We told you about that, like the first to the product advantage or the advantage of branding. That didn't get attention from Singapore. They next told us that governments just can't afford to pay for this kind of development. There's not the overall willingness in the economy or in the country to put lots of money towards buying technology that stops climate change. That is also equally a problem for your side of the house, particularly given environmentally friendly technology.
What those
private goods that consumers buy, it's things that the government has to purchase on a massive scale to make a huge dent in carbon pollution. We also told you your team stopped innovation because you inhibited the incentives to actually collaborate and share knowledge, and that was harmful, and you also increased the propensity to hoard patents in a very harmful way. Before I go on, yes.
Climate change is multi-causal. Sometimes the greatest source of pollution tend to be other corporations. Why do you force corporations which develop green technology to shoulder the bulk of this responsibility for climate change?
Yeah, so we think like all sorts of intellectual property are questionable in debate. We'll have a debate about that another day. This is a debate about whether it's in the public interest to nullify patents of green technology, and we've shown you why it is. Finally, on predatory pricing, we said that it's a very good thing at the heart of their cases that they'll just make green technology so cheap. But do they happy to have competition laws to prevent any harm to the extent that they actually existed? So at the end of this thing, we tell you we do get more innovation under this side of the house. Even if we don't get more innovation, it is still better because that innovation comes far more cheaply and is far more available to the people who need it. Lastly, on the ancillary impacts. We told you a second that this brings more political capital to the environmental movement because it's now not seen as benefiting huge corporations that own the patent to green technology. This wasn't directly engaged with, but just said that their third argument reacts to it. They said that companies will no longer lobby for eco-friendly legislation. We say not all lobbying for eco-friendly legislation is necessarily good. For example, ExxonMobil's lobbying for a carbon tax simply because they want to increase the price of oil, which is less carbon intensive. We think in general this promotes voters' incentive to vote for eco-friendly technology, which is more important than the power of corporations. What has Australia shown you in this debate? We told you intellectual property is questionable in all cases, particularly does not deserve to apply in this. We told you we get more innovation, but even if that's true, even if that's not true, we get cheaper and more available innovation, and this strengthens the environmental movement in general we propose.
I thank for the opposition speaker for his speech, and now to continue the case for the opposition, and we call upon the opposition team.
The underlying narrative of Proposition's case is that something has to be done now before we die from climate change. But what they actually do is saddle us with technology from 2010 for the next 50 years, doing nothing to slow the inexorable march of global warming. By undermining the immediacy of the problem right from the start of their third speaker, they have already implicitly conceded that the best way forward is development and fostering innovation among corporations, a case that we have brought to you consistently from all three speakers. Two key areas I will discuss today. One, on why intellectual property is property. Second, on improving green technology and why our side does it better. First, on intellectual property. Now, we had a really simplistic argument that intellectual property is not like physical property because it has three characteristics. One, more than one person can have the idea and it's arbitrary. Two, it's got other ideas. And three, it's funded by public money. We argue that this is no different from any kind of physical property I own. First, the fact that I was born morally arbitrary, relatively privileged means that I have a car and the internet. So I will be able to buy a house much quicker than someone else. But the fact that morally arbitrary circumstances allow me to lay claim to that house faster, no thank you, doesn't affect my claim to the property of that house. It doesn't mean a poor man can come up to me and say, hey, it was morally arbitrary, you got that house, now give me half of your property. Arbitrariness is a substitute for analysis. Second claim, we argue that all claim to property is built on pre-existing ideas and historical confluence. If I were to write a book, it is based on a language I never created, on a computer I never invented. But my unique contribution towards arranging the words and creating the plot grants me autonomy over that particular creation. We draw then the parallel to patents, because researchers and companies, no thank you, have made use of a pre-existing set of ideas and knowledge to synthesize a revolutionary idea. The value addedness provides a kind of autonomy over the creation. Third key clause, then on public funding. We argue that publicly funded institutions cannot monopolize research precisely because they are funded by the government. Therefore, they tend to produce research that enters the intellectual commons anyway. This is a moot point. But how about companies like General Motors, which we bailed out? No thank you. We argue that in that case, the exchange of moral duties has already occurred, because at the point of me bailing out General Motors, I've already placed conditionalities upon that loan. So I've already imposed on you those burdens. Just because we pay a company doesn't mean the company will forever be enthralled to the government forever. That's redundant and moot, right? So we argue that intellectual property is real property, and proposition is using the argument of strict utility to justify theft. No thank you. What's the problem? The logical extension of that case is that they will then take, for instance, the patent to the iPhone away, because the social utility of everyone on earth getting a cheap iPhone is really great, but the comparative utility to Apple is really small. We argue that this is bad, because when it comes to property rights, bright white lines have to be drawn. And in the case of the judging of whether or not it's right to property, our paradigm of how morality works makes more sense. But even if it wasn't real property, we have still argued that we strike a better balance between your right to property and social utility. That's why patent rights expire. That's what my first video told you about. And we heard no response to this balancing act that patents have between your right to property and social utility. We draw the parallel again to tax, because we don't tax all your income, because we recognize that some balancing of your right to property versus the social good is needed. So your parallel on tax actually proves our principle and policy of patents, right? So on to my second larger clash, which will be on improving green technology. The first thing we heard from their team is that in the dying moments of the third speech, that not all lobbying for eco-friendly policies is necessarily good. No thank you. I posit to you that it doesn't matter what the motivations are for a company to lobby for eco-friendly policies. Because at the point that we reduce corporate obstructionism, we create the incentives and the governmental push for things like legislative, give me a moment, man, protocols to reduce carbon emissions. So we don't care about your motivations. But before I go on, yes, ma'am.
Is it legitimate for Royal Dutch Shell to buy out products of green technology?
Thanks, ma'am. Yes, we think it is, because at the point at which they research this green technology and they innovate on this green technology, the future development of that green technology provides individuals with lower cost and better products in the future. That's exactly what my first speaker argued, so that's with the POI dealt with. So back to my point. Clearly, we argue that we create incentives for companies to actually prevent the kind of obstructionism that happens in political sphere, something that was not fully rebutted by the team. No thank you. Next thing we heard, we have created a tension in our case, because states also pick winners by subsidizing companies. No! The burden on our side is on companies to prove that a particular licensing fee will be worth subsidizing. But on their side, the state is tasked with the massive burden of determining what kind of research is good. So there's no tension here. The burden is on companies on our side. And given that they've predicated their entire case on the model of the state, here are 5 reasons why the government is bad. 1, because governments fund research with billions and billions of taxpayer dollars. If they are so worried about gouging consumers, they gouge the taxpayer. Ladies and gentlemen, British Petroleum took 8 years and $12 billion to develop carbon capture technology. That is money that is coming from the common man in the street. They gouge people as well. Second reason why governments are bad, because they often collude with large companies that have the ability to lobby. That's what my second speaker told you about how small medium enterprises are killed, because the larger companies with the kind of political clout and the ability to engage in things like regulatory capture that enable them to get kinds of monopolies over research by governments. Third reason why governments are bad, they have no expertise. Now, my first speaker wants to be a civil servant one day, and if he's confronted with a plan between carbon sequestration and creating energy from ice, how in the world is he going to tell the difference and economic value of either plan? We argue that the best way forward in deciding where resources are allocated are companies with the expertise and the science behind how to prioritize the kind of investment. Fourth reason why governments are bad, because governments are bad for innovation because they don't want to think outside the box. Any misstep will get them pilloried at the box office. So they don't want to go outside of what these conventional law. No thank you. Fifth reason why governments are bad, because states are inherently profit driven. So there's a tendency to rubber stamp decisions, even if we may concede that they don't always not think outside the box. So even when they do, they tend not to be profit driven, so they are less discriminating when it comes to their investment. So clearly, at the end of this debate, when you listen to the language used by their team, when the state takes over, when the public does it, what they've really done is put the entire case on the illusory utopic solution of the government taking over all research. What I've just done is show how, the structures of a government undermines all the benefits they want to talk about. Next thing we heard, systemic problems with patents exist, you can't just reform the system. First of all, we argue that's why courts exist. That's why, for instance, Apple just can't claim that Samsung has stolen its design for the rectangle because the courts have deemed that wrong, right? So we think court mechanisms already exist to rectify for this imbalance. Secondly, even if patent trolls exist, the fact that these patents aren't developed by companies suggests that they're the least profitable patents anyway. So that the fact that they aren't developed by companies doesn't actually lead to a net harm on our side, because these patents are worthless anyway. Okay, so the last thing we heard, the patent law office is inefficient. Let me remind you that their alternative is using the government to study whether or not your policies will be effective. Their solution is to flip through tomes and tomes of patent documents to determine whether or not it will help society. And they force this all upon a government institution, and they call our patent office ineffective. And we'd like to remind the House once again that my second speaker's first year on predatory pricing was never touched. We argue that this increases prices in the long term, further gouging consumers. I am incredibly proud to stand on opposition.
The opposition team will be delivered their reply speech first. There are no points of information during to reply speech. To deliver the opposition reply speech, I will call upon the opposition team.
Towards the end of the debate, it became increasingly clear that proposition was really basing their case on two things. First, on this illusory notion that we will all perish by 2020. Secondly, that governments are wonderful. So with that, I'm going to take a look at the two votes we saw in today's debate and show us opposition's vote that truly understood the incentive structures of companies and as a result, improved the environment. But first, what was the vote of the proposition? It was a vote that believed in this magical panacea of the government, and we thought only Singaporeans were naive enough to trust government to exist. But first, in proposition's vote, where BP took 8 years and 12 billion just to develop carbon capture technologies, governments would pay for that, and not only for that, but for every single company out there. When their vote, when governments around the world were in debt and having ballooning defense budgets, they could easily show that this cost that would otherwise have been covered by patents. Patent officers suck, but your governments are going to have the time to pore over every single piece of green technology you have, estimate the risk and profits, and develop some magical solution. In their vote, most governments would be risk averse because they didn't want to lose votes at the ballot box. But somehow, you will be most willing to undertake the most risky as well as unproven, unpredictable kinds of green technology that might potentially save us from 2020. The logical conclusion is this: if governments don't work in proposition's vote, then there is no innovation. If there is no innovation, they make climate change worse, they hurt our environment. And in proposition's vote, this is precisely what happens. But proposition never understood the incentive structures of companies. In their vote, companies will continue to support cap and trade and carbon taxes even when their green technology interests were no longer protected by patent laws, and now they had more to lose rather than to gain. In their vote, compensation from the government would be more than what they could have otherwise have gained from a patent, and this would keep innovation alive and vibrant. So this is the kind of ridiculous and naive vote that proposition base their case on. What then was the alternative view we presented you with in opposition? Yes, we understood that all of us are tempted into believing that corporations are evil monsters. But no, this taboo is ridiculous and unfounded because employees working within corporations, they have rights too. They have their own lifetime savings too. And you can't just steal his idea just for some greater social utility or greater social good. That's why we pointed out, even though we tax you, we don't tax you all of your income, even though that might really benefit the starving child on the street, because it's always a balancing act between your rights as well as greater social utility. Proposition skews that balance. In our world, corporations will no longer depress wages. Therefore, even on their own metric of less technology but cheaper technology, proposition failed because we proved to you that when predatory pricing occurs, that's when you don't get cheaper technology. In their third speaker, they made a late and flippant reply, honestly, that well, it's good if all corporations price their technology at low prices. This is not the point of the argument. It's that once they price their technology low, they then crowd out other companies and this allows them to drive prices back up. So they never tackled that argument in its full integrity. But next, we understood the full spectrum of corporations. For large corporations, you now shift their incentives towards manufacturing rather than innovation, because now that's where the bulk of profits lay, since they no longer have anything to gain from innovation. But even for SMEs, given that they tend to profit by selling their patents to larger corporations, that's where we protected their ability to do so, now that we protected innovation with patent laws. But more than that, because green technology is easily research intensive and cost heavy, that's why we give companies the incentive to continue investing in green technology even though it might be unprofitable at face value. That's why we stand by the principle that turning private research into public property only hurts the environment.
And now to conclude the case for the proposition and the debate as a whole, I will call upon the proposition team.
Ladies and gentlemen, the problem with this opposition's case is that they operated in a paradigm in which the world was not as gravely threatened by climate change as it was in reality. We thought that in that difficult social context that we presented here, it was unreasonable to expect we could prioritise companies' rights to profit from those innovations at the expense of the people who would suffer because of it. Let's look at two things to reflect on this measure. The first is whether this was a justifiable infringement on intellectual property, and the second is about which team ensured the improvements of the environment. So let's start with intellectual property. The main grunt of the opposition's case was to say that these were the ideas to which people had a right, and that was invaded by this policy. We had three key responses. The first was to question whether that right to intellectual property was inherent. We pointed to three key reasons why it wasn't. The first was because often it relied on public funding, such as in the case of universities. We gave you instances of where this was significant. We thought that it would be a reasonable expectation for those institutions to think that they had to pay some of those profits back. But secondly, we said that even where they weren't public funded, they relied on ideas that were already in the public sphere. Lastly, we pointed out that often these innovations and patents weren't of the genuine type the opposition wanted to support, or indicative of problems with the patent office that this opposition was unlikely to reform. The opposition in response, especially in the opposition bloc, wanted to ask why that logic wouldn't apply to all types of patents or all types of property. But that was preempted all the way back at first proposition, when we said that in general we thought patent rights were questionable, but given that they generally tended to improve people's overall utility, we would afford them. We thought that mechanism failed in this instance, we should afford it. But secondly, we said that even if this was right, we kept it. In response to a point of information, the opposition acknowledged that you could invade on people's private property for the sake of tax. That proved that you didn't have to provide people the full rewards of their intellectual property, just the partial rewards that we also got through our mechanism of subsidization. But thirdly, we said that even if this was a right, at some point we had to prioritize the rights of others. That was why even this opposition's payments ran out after 25 years, a tension which they never sufficiently resolved. It was why, in response to a point of information at second opposition, they acknowledged that if we could prove that the risks of climate change were sufficiently significant, then it would be necessary to have that intervention on private property. We didn't think that we had to prove that everyone was going to drown in this debate. We just had to show, as all of our speakers did, that this risk was so great that it would be irreversible if we left it for much longer. And that was why, even if this was an infringement on private property, it was worth it if we could prove this second issue, which is about improvements for the environment. Singapore wanted to suggest, firstly on this issue, that there would be less innovation with a smaller profit incentives. We pointed out, firstly, that there was still significant private profit incentives. We pointed to a first mover advantage and branding and imaging benefits, none of which Singapore responded to. But secondly, to the extent that there was any shortfall, public funding would make up for it. We pointed to subsidies, tax concessions, and research grants. The opposition's response was to suggest that the state would not give winners, especially at third opposition. We thought that there was a problem for this case that the opposition also relied on that same stated mechanism to a significant extent. And we didn't hear sufficiently from the third opposition what exactly it was about the processes that private firms used to determine winners which the government would use too. In actual fact though, we thought it was likely that innovation would be significantly more efficient on the outside because your incentive was to release it now, rather than at the point at which these innovations had appreciated so significantly as to be less useful. But let's just assume they had more innovations. They still didn't win this debate because we had better innovations. We said that they would be out in the open, which made it more likely that there would be economies of scale that opposition wanted to support. We said it would drive down prices, as second opposition recognised, although we were happy to have anti-competitive legislation to stop the problems that they wanted to point to. But most importantly in this debate, we said the benefits of those innovations would go to everyone, including those in the developing world, rather than just those few people who could afford them. Ladies and gentlemen, this debate was not about maximising the bottom line of companies, it's about protecting the people who need protection most, only the population.
Firstly, thank you very much for your patience, and thank you very much for an extremely engaging debate. I think I speak on behalf of all the judges in saying that perhaps one of the best debates I've seen in these preliminary rounds. It was deserving of two very strong teams, and you should feel extremely proud of it, and you should also be very pleased that you've now got to the end of the prelims. I'm sure that's a huge relief for you all, so congratulations. Okay? Yeah. So you didn't make that easy on the judges at all, and as a consequence, it ended up being a split decision, which is perhaps unsurprising, I'm not sure. And it was a split decision with an extremely close margin, with extremely similar marks across all the ballots from all the adjudicators. So it just came down to which different things the adjudicators favoured. Now, in this debate, we did feel that there was a shift slightly as the debate went on. We felt the third proposition from Australia started extremely strong, they were extremely persuasive in characterising the debate. And that perhaps like Singapore could have benefited from kind of dealing with some of the argumentation inside proposition's initial case a little bit more strategically and effectively. However, as the debate shifted, perhaps the momentum was lost to timing from the side proposition or gained from the side opposition. So you can imagine that meant the arguments either side were shifting in terms of how the judges favoured them. Some of the panel felt that side proposition is extremely good at setting up the necessity of this debate, and particularly the need and why this was a unique set of circumstances for a very particular cause. While other members of the panel felt that what side Singapore were particularly good at is not only saying, well, we don't necessarily think that need exists, although perhaps there needs to be a bit more engagement on that, but more to the point that sort of in terms of the long term and the future developments, and in terms of the mechanism of state actually being the one to implement it, side Singapore had a bit more nuance on that. The question was to what extent those arguments were developed, and the majority of the panel felt that in terms of the content, the side proposition were a little bit stronger at proving that necessity. Then it also came down to sort of a strategic question mark and a stylistic question mark, which is sometimes unusual in these debates. It wasn't just about content that the judges were looking at, or it didn't just go down to content. We felt that one team had a little bit more strength in style in terms of its consistency. And we equally felt that one team, perhaps strategically, by setting out the debate the way they did, had a little bit more strength. So, on a balance, and an extremely close one, the judges that felt the side proposition had set up the debate clearly, and that perhaps had a few edges and a few other criteria, won the debate, and that's why on a split decision it went to Team Australia.